Hey guys, welcome back. Today we are talking about a couple of cool rifles, but what prompted me to bring out the rifle you see here in my hands is another rifle that I finally decided to do a video on. But before we get into today's video, guys, if you enjoy our content and you like the channel, you could really help us out by simply clicking like, share, and subscribe. And if you do that, that helps us out tremendously with the algorithms. And also, please comment down below. We read all of your comments and we love hearing what you guys have to say. With all that being said, let's get started with today's video. Guys, please swing by and check out Big Daddy Unlimited, BDU. They help support us here at the Military Arms Channel with products and things like that so we can continue to bring you content. There's a link in the video description down below that'll take you to the Mac blog and website. Please follow that link, and from there you'll find a link to Big Daddy Unlimited and try them out just for 99 cents. You can see what they're all about. In essence, they're just like a big online store that has amazing prices. So please, again, check out BDU. Around 1954, the Commonwealth countries around the UK adopted a variation of this rifle. Many of you know it as the FN-FAL. Other people will know it as the SLR, and other folks will know it as the L1A1. The rifle I have here in my hands was manufactured in Lithgow. It is an Australian manufactured. L1A1 is a semi-automatic only rifle. There's Edens and Onyx that brought in various guns and receivers and whatnot. This one is Edens. This rifle has not been fired much at all, just a few rounds. But it's really important to talk about this rifle first, because the gun I want to show you guys, another piece of really cool history that very few guns exist globally, much less in the United States. We have to talk about this rifle first. So there are two different variations of the FN-FAL, L1A1, whatever. There's the metric, and then there's the inch pattern, the imperial system. Most of the Commonwealth countries adopted the version you see here, which is the inch pattern, as we call it, which means it was developed using imperial measurements. The Belgians had originally designed the FAL using the metric system. Well, when the Commonwealth countries in the UK adopted this gun, starting right around the mid-1950s, they were still using the imperial system that we use here in the United States. But in the 1960s, they would adopt a metric system. But they maintained their SLRs that were based on the inch pattern. And I'm not going to go into any great detail about the differences between the metric and inch pattern rifles. Just suffice it to say, you can tell by looking at the trigger guard, the pistol grip, and a few other things like the rear sight, the front sight block, the front handguards. This is very distinctively an L1A1 or an SLR rifle. Now, this carried most of our allied nations in NATO through the Cold War. We obviously tampered and messed around with other rifles like the M14 before adopting the M16 after we convinced all of our allies to adopt the 308. Long story, interesting story, but that's for another video. This gun went on to serve the Australians up until the 1980s. In the late 1970s, they started to look for another rifle to be more in line with our own US M16. They wanted something in 5.56 by 45 versus 7.62 by 51 NATO, which this rifle is chambered in. And so there was a bit of a competition going on. So historically speaking, modern rifles, the Australians didn't really have any indigenous designs that they adopted. They always adopted somebody else's rifle. Case in point, the L1A1 that was originally designed by FN. So there was one competitor that popped up, and that's what today's video is about, is this competitor that was entered into the race. It would be this rifle we're going to talk about in a moment, the L1A1 you see here, and it would go up against also the M16 from the United States and the Steyr-AUG. So before we get into that rifle, I just wanted to show you this one because these are not very common rifles. There's a lot of parts kits guns out there. People do build inch pattern rifles like this, but this is an Australian made rifle, which makes it rather unique. It's in pristine condition because, again, I almost never fire it. So I'm going to go ahead and fire 10 rounds here for you guys so you guys can see how the gun works. It's just a beautiful piece of eye candy. You'll notice that the carrying handle is made out of a polymer, and it's kind of green. It does not have a last round bolt hold open. It has the sand cuts in the bolt carrier. It's got the folding, what some folks would call the para charging handle, which is non-reciprocating. Very distinctive handguards, and just simply a beautiful, beautiful rifle. The inch pattern mags and the metric mags are slightly different. This is an inch pattern mag. I'm going to go ahead and lock it in. It rocks and locks. It has a bolt release, just like, a magazine release right here that you can pinch with your thumb and rock the magazine out or back in. Here is a manual bolt hold open, so the gun will not lock open on the last round fired. They've not included that functionality in the L1A1, but if you want to manually lock the bolt open, you can do that and release it with that little tab. So I'm going to go ahead and charge up 10 rounds here. Let's do a little shooting with this beauty, then talk about the next rifle I really want to talk about. I'm going to knock that target over. Okay, does not lock open on the last shot fired. I can drop that magazine out. If I want to pull the bolt to the rear and push up on the manual bolt hold, I can then lock that bolt open. So this is it, the L1A1 or SLR, a very, very cool piece of Cold War history. Now let's take a look at a gun that is even more rare than this by a long shot in the United States and elsewhere in the world, that I think is a pretty darn cool rifle, but it was never adopted by any military. I always like to preface videos like this by making a disclaimer. I am not a historian. I know just enough about each firearm in my collection to be dangerous. I've purchased every firearm in my collection for a very specific reason, and I have a basic understanding of the history of each of the firearms. I'm not like some of the other gun channels out there that will do mounds and mounds of research before they produce a video, which makes for extremely good content, and that's why I'm going to point you over to Chris at Small Arms Solutions, who made a video about the Australian Leader T2 Mk5 rifle a couple of years ago. He goes into great detail about the history of this firearm, breaks it down for you guys, and we'll take it further apart than I'm willing to take this one apart. As he'll note in his video, this is one of the most rare guns in my collection. I've debated whether or not to even bring it out until today. I'd never fired it. But as you guys know, I always say I fire every gun in my collection. If I won't shoot it, I won't own it. And I was just waiting for the day to happen, and today was that day. It just, me and Jason were talking, it's like, man, let's do the Leader. I'm like, okay. And so I've put my famous helicopter tape right there behind the ejection port, just in the off chance that it would put a brass mark on it. Yes, I'm that anal about my collectibles. So I'll put a link down to Chris's video in the video description below, so you can get a good, I think it's a 20-minute long video about the entire history of this rifle. So the rifles I have laid out here in front of me were rifles that the Australians were considering to replace their L1A1 rifles. And they took a look at the American M16A1, which I have here on the bottom. This is one of the new-ish Colt retro guns that they made before they got into financial trouble, then quit making them. They also considered the Austrian, not Australian, but the Austrian Steyr, and this is an original pre-ban. And then we have the Leader rifle, the T2 Mk5, and this was a rifle developed by a gentleman by the name of Charles St. George, and he wanted to break the mold of Australia buying weapons from other countries and submit a gun for consideration by the Australian military to adopt and to manufacture right there in Australia. And so this rifle went up against these and perhaps others. Again, I'm not all up on the history of exactly what took place in those trials, but I just wanted to show you the three guns that led up to this one being considered for military service. Now we're going to set the other rifles aside here, and when we come back, we're going to take a deep dive into the Leader T2 Mk5 and talk about it, some of its heritage, where it drew some of its inspiration, and what makes it somewhat interesting and a little bit different from other guns on the market. Before we can have a conversation about the Leader rifle, we really have to bring the AR18 or 180 into the discussion. So after the development of the M16, which is truly a first world weapon in terms of the technology required to manufacture it in mass numbers, a lot of countries either couldn't afford to invest in that type of tooling and technology or didn't want to. During the Second World War, stampings were used extensively across a number of different weapons that were developed for the war by Germany, by Great Britain, by the United States. Think about the grease gun in the United States. Think about the Sten gun from Great Britain. Think about the STG-44 from Germany, or the MG-42 light machine gun. All made use extensively of stamped components. Why stampings? Well, stampings, pretty much any country can tool up to do a stamped firearm. It's an older technology, but it also lends itself well to keeping costs down and manufacturing stuff very quickly. So throughout the Cold War, you would see countries using stamped firearms, even though they, weapons like the M16 existed, which are very precisely made weapon systems, very, I would say a step above the stamped offerings out there. So you would see, like the SA-80 adopted by Great Britain. It was heavily based on the AR-180 itself. It's a stamped receiver. The Germans used stamped receivers for their HK91 or G3 rifles, which they got from Spain, which was developed with the help of German engineers after the Second World War with the Set-Me rifle, which made use of stampings. So you get where I'm going. So that's what the thought process was behind the Leader rifle. Let's make use of stampings. Let's not make extensive use of polymers for the internal components and things like that, which we'd see with the Steyr AUG rifle. The trigger components and stuff make extensive use of polymers, but they did want to make use of polymers where they could lighten it and it would also be more durable than wood. But beyond being stamped, there is a very, very, close kinship between these two rifles. The AR-18 heavily influenced the development of the Leader rifle. So let me take the AR-18 apart here for you really quick and show you that, and then we can start our discussion about the Leader rifle. I'm not going to go into great detail about how to field strip this gun and stuff like that, because this is not the topic of today's video, but disassembly and stuff I want you to see, because this is very similar to what we're going to find with the Leader. So we have a clamshelling upper and lower receiver, again, a stamped upper and lower receiver, but we have a takedown lever right here behind the rear sight protective ears. And to take it apart, you just kind of push that pin in and push forward, and that will allow the weapon to hinge open on a pivot pin here in the front. If you take a look inside of the AR-18, extensive use of stampings and castings. I'll get that and show it to you here in a moment. So anyway, even the hammer is stamped on the rifle. So to take the bolt out, you would just take out your recoil spring and guide rods, which they did that for me already. I'll pick those up here in a moment and show them to you. To take the bolt out, just draw the bolt to the rear. There's a little slot there that allows you to draw out the charging handle, and there's the bolt. Now I'm going to set this thing aside, and while Jason gets a good look at this bolt, because this is very important to the conversation, I'm going to grab that recoil spring and guide rod system that launched itself. And here's the recoil spring and guide rods. Notice there are 2 rods and 2 recoil springs. Again, you're going to find this in the SA-80 rifle, and on the front you're going to find inside the bolt carrier a rotating bolt that is very, very similar in design to the M16. So let's keep that out, set these parts aside, and now let's take a look at the Leader. Now I'm going to talk about the internal components first, and then I'm going to back off and talk about some of the features externally of the rifle. It has a magazine release right here, which is just a very simple button. Drops the magazine out and makes use of standard Stenag magazines. The charging handle is non-reciprocating. It's forward here. There are no facilities to lock the bolt open, either automatically or manually. So when you pull the charging handle to the rear, you can look inside the ejection port there, make sure that the weapon is clear, and then the bolt is going to go home. Now remember when I told you how the AR-18 came apart? You have basically a little T-shaped pin with a plunger that you'd push into the rear sight protective ears. Well, you just have a tab here on the Leader. Accomplishes the same thing. Push forward on that, and the Leader hinges open, just like the AR-18. Now, you can take out the bolt and carrier I'm going to set the, again, I just want to point out the extensive use of stampings throughout, okay? The upper and lower stamped. You can see support structures that are stamped and then welded internally. It has a very AR-15-ish type trigger, but this gun shares no commonality in terms of parts between the M16 and this rifle, with the exception of the magazine and the caliber. So even though the hammer looks like just a bigger, fatter M16 hammer, it's still different. There's no parts compatibility there. So now let's take a look at this, which is quite interesting. So here we have the AR18 and we have the Australian Leader. The first thing that's going to jump out at you guys is the shape of the bolt head. Now this was done for a couple of different reasons. This wasn't the first use of a triangular shaped bolt head. Winchester had a Model 100 self-loading rifle that predates the Leader rifle, which had a similar three-lug pattern. It wasn't a perfect triangle, it had more defined lugs, but it was similar in concept. But if you take a look at the two side by side, there is no denying that the Leader borrows heavily from the AR-18. Now, the AR-18 is user serviceable, meaning you have a little push pin here. You take a tip of the bullet, push that, it comes out. You can take your firing pin out, you take your cam pin out, and disassemble the bolt and carrier for maintenance. A great big departure from that, which we saw later in the Bren 805, which they later changed in the Bren 2. This is meant to only be field stripped to this point by the end user. Anything past this level of disassembly would be considered an armorer's level job. You have a roll pin that holds the spring and firing pin in place that needs to be punched out, which would then let you take the cam pin out and then take the three-lug bolt out. Also, where the AR-18 does not have captive springs, you will find that the springs on the Leader are captive, and there's a C-clamp holding it in place. So once again, it is not designed by the troop to be able to take it any further apart than this for basic field maintenance, which I think would be something that ultimately probably wasn't favored by the military. I wouldn't adopt that. You really want troops to be able to clean their weapons. You don't want your armor to have to take your bolt carrier group apart. But I would also say that this rifle is not a completed thought. This really didn't make it past the prototype stages. Very, very few of these rifles exist in the world at all, and even fewer of them exist in the United States. So I'm going to go ahead and put the weapon back together. So this is all you would do for field maintenance. You will also notice that if you take a look at the trigger pins, we have E-clips holding all the pins in place. We even have an E-clip holding the front pivot pin in place, but you can separate the upper and lowers if you want to, but you run the risk of those E-clips flying off, so I'm not going to take them apart. Putting it back together, there's no charging handle like the AR-18. It just simply drops right in there, so it's super simple for reassembly. You just push it down, push on that tab, line up the upper and lowers, and she's back together. So let's do a little bit of shooting with the Leader rifle, but before we do that, let's start off at the rear here and work our way forward talking about the features of the firearm. So when they were developing the weapon, they worked very closely with manufacturers outside the United States, so they would have sourced the barrels outside of the United States. DuPont assisted with making this really dense polymer that would be used in the stocks. This stuff has aged very well. This gun was only made, I think it started around 1978, and then I don't know when production technically ceased. Again, not very many of these things were produced. There was no military interest in them whatsoever, and civilian sales weren't that strong. And you know, Leader Dynamics just really wasn't capable of producing a whole bunch of them. So it just kind of died off after the military turned its nose up to it. So we have that dense polymer stock back here. It's non-folding. And then we come down to this very, exaggerated grip, which is actually quite comfortable with texturing on it. It has the LD in it for Leader Dynamics. And we move up to the rear sight. The rear sight is very interesting. It is a dial. And this dial is marked for 1, 2, and 300 meters. And so there's a detent on the front of the dial that you push this detent in, and then you can turn it to the distance that you would want to fire the weapon at. You zero the rifle by adjusting the windage here with the knob on the left-hand side of the rear sight protective ear. So that's how you would adjust your windage. And then to zero your elevation, you have a small set screw in the front sight block, and you have to loosen that screw, and then you can use an AK tool to turn the front sight up and down to get your elevation zeroed out for you, and then lock that set screw down and it won't move. The front sight's a little bit different. It's not a post. It's more of a flat wing type of arrangement. So you have to make a full half turn to get a proper sight picture. It's not as fine as like an M16 sight, which is just a post. So that's pretty interesting. The gas block is very minimalistic right here. It's non-adjustable. It's a 3-piece short stroke gas piston system in it. And again, we've already talked about what it looks like on the inside. On top, we have truly what would be considered a carrying handle for the weapon, but it's made of maybe 16 gauge stamped steel. It has holes in it as if it were intended to have an optic on it, much like the Colt M16 has a single hole in the carrying handle where they would mount optics and later night vision devices and things like that to the early M16s. I don't know of any optics that were specifically made for this gun. Also, you'll notice there are witness holes cut through the carrying handle, so you have clear line of sight through it, so you can see through the carrying handle, if you will. The front of the handguard, this is all that high-density polymer, has vent holes on the top, have a very small charging handle. It doesn't fold. You can't rotate it up like an H&K. Again, there's no way to lock the bolt to the rear on this weapon, but it is a non-reciprocating charging handle, so you can fire it with your thumb behind the charging handle. It's not going to whack you. We have vent holes down here, and again, this gun just does not lend itself well to being used in the field by a grunt, because to take the handguards off to get to your gas system, it requires tools. And so it's a 2-piece handguard. You'd remove these screws and take the handguard off, and then you can take the multi-part gas piston out of it. Think of a G36 or something like that, or even an AR18. We have a bayonet lug here, which is a standard M16 style bayonet lug, and then just a simple bird cage out on the end of the barrel. The barrels do have a chrome lined bore, and I'm not sure what the twist rate is on that. That's something that eludes me right now. But it was designed to shoot 55 grain ball. We talked about the magazine release being right here, and it looks very M16-ish on the other side, obviously because it uses a Stanag magazine. Very simple fire controls. You have safe and fire, a stamped piece being the selector lever, and then you just have a simple parked finish, which is a very good looking clean rifle. The recoil impulse on this thing is just so light. It's even lighter than the AR18, and it just seems to be really, really nicely gassed. It's not wildly overgassed like so many different military rifles, and maybe that is another reason why it may have not fared well in the military trials against weapons like the Steyr AUG or the M16 and weapons like that. To load it, we have some 55 grain ball, and this is from our friends over at Federal. We want to thank our friends at Federal for supporting us with free ammunition to the channel. We're only firing 10 rounds per magazine because we're hurting for ammo just like the rest of you guys are. So we're minimizing our ammo consumption. Now the magazine well is very minimalistic. And Chris had said that he thought that, it was maybe just a little undersized, but I've used just standard USGI Stanag magazines, and mine fit and function fine in this gun. This gun does not get shot a lot, and it doesn't get shot at all. So I brought it out just today to show it to you guys. Now I do want to make note of, you can see the rather ugly resistance welds here on the receiver, and I'm going to get a shot of what it says on the side of the receiver. It says import World Public Safety, Culver City, California, USA. World Public Safety, love that. All right, so let's charge the weapon up. I got a 20-round magazine in it. You just reach up here, grab your charging handle, pull it fully to the rear, and release it. And now the weapon's ready to go. Flip her over to fire. And let's do a little shooting with the Leader. All right, you'll notice click no bang. It does not lock open, even though the magazine would support that type of functionality. So you would drop your magazine out, pull the bolt to the rear, make sure that the weapon's empty, and put it on safe. Now again, a very muted recoil impulse. The sight pictures, it's kind of different because it's so much going on back here that kind of blocks your peripheral vision, but it's not a bad sight picture. It's very reminiscent of an M16, just a little bit more stuff going on around here that kind of blocks your view around the sight. Very ergonomic. The hand guards and stuff, just a little bit loose, but overall a really good fit and finish on the gun. I would say this is, much higher quality than the Sterling-made AR18 rifles like I showed you earlier in the video. Simply a beautiful gun. In the end, the Leader T2 Mk5 simply didn't make the cut in terms of military service, and so the gun was abandoned. It wound up becoming a collector's piece, and it's a really cool piece of military history. And I'm glad I finally got around to making a video about the gun, because it's one of those things you just don't see all that often. Now, I want to say that they had a pistol version of this. They brought in the rifle and I believe a pistol version, but this is long before braces and things like that. What these things go for today, honestly, guys, I have no idea. It would be something you would have to buy at auction, and I could only speculate as to their current value. But I hope you enjoyed this. And again, I really highly recommend you go buy Small Arms Solutions and check out Chris's video about the detailed history of this firearm if you just want to see the 3-piece gas system or things like that. He does that in that video, and there's no reason for me to redo that. So please check out Chris's video. So the rifle that won out was the Austrian AUG, and that's what Australia wound up using. Australia just recently updated their AUG rifles to the F90. We did have an opportunity to shoot one of those several years ago at an event called Big 3. They were talking about bringing them into the United States and selling them as semi-automatic civilian rifles, but then the government of Australia decided to shut that down. They didn't want to sell weapons of war to civilians. Not surprising given their gun laws. So the AUG has been in military service around the globe since right around 1977, which is where it picks up its STG-77 nomenclature. And this has been an amazing weapon. For people that don't think bullpups are viable infantry rifles, I would disagree with you. The Israelis have made extensive use of bullpups, and this rifle has served globally with a number of different militaries, law enforcement, and paramilitary groups, and continues on to this very day. This is easily one of the most successful Cold War 5.56 rifles ever developed. And so it's not surprising, again, that this is the rifle that the Australians went with. Guys, I really hope you enjoyed today's video. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider becoming part of our Patreon family. We're supported by you, our viewing audience. We've built a wonderful community over on Patreon. You get access directly to me. I answer all private communications. We have a great community going on with community discussions. You get early access to videos and blog posts and stuff that the rest of the world simply doesn't get to see. So again, there's a link down below to Patreon. Also, if you'd like to support us right here underneath the video player you're watching right now, just to click that little join button and you can support us right here on YouTube. And last but not least, guys, please swing by and check out coppercustom.com. Thank you for 13 years of support, and we'll talk to you guys soon. We're going to take you out with 10 rounds of Federal 5.56, actually 223 from a pre-ban Steyr AUG. Again, guys, thanks for the support. We'll talk to you guys soon. Oh, you know what? I'm going to record. Let's see if I can get some hits. I got a new camera system sitting over there, and see if I can score some hits with the donut of death at 250 yards. Hopefully you guys are able to see that. New system. Let's see how it works. We'll talk to you guys soon.